Hello everyone, this is Ken DeLong, author of The Economic Comic, and today I want to talk to you about our financial system and why I consider it to be fraudulent to the core. A lot of people they say things like, well, the system's rigged, it's rigged against you, but they can't really say how or why or what's wrong with the system that causes it to be rigged against you. I'm going to try to explain that to you here today. And one thing to note is that the financial economy, the financial system is incredibly complex. I don't think there's a single human being who truly understands it. And you can tell this by listening to the big fund managers, the guys who are managing hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. It's their job, it's their livelihood, it's their fortunes that depend on them understanding the system. And they all describe it differently. It's like the three blind men and the elephant. So it makes you wonder, does anyone really know what's going on here? And certainly I don't think the Fed knows what's going on. So I'm going to try to explain it to you in comic form, in a very simple manner, because we are the economic comic here. And to do so, I'm going to take you through several steps. So this video is going to be a little bit longer than most of my other videos, but I think if you stick through to the end, you'll be rewarded by some understanding. All right, so I'm going to start with something very simple and very concrete. There's a guy with the gold coin, right? Let's call this guy the dealer. And the dealer is happy to sell his gold coin. Now there's another guy who doesn't have a gold coin, let's call him the speculator. And the speculator thinks that the price of gold is going up over the next 2 weeks or month or something like that. So he'd like to buy the dealer's coin, hold on to it for a couple weeks, and then sell it when the price goes up. All right, that's called speculating. So he calls up the gold dealer. He says, hey, I want to buy your coin. The gold dealer says, sure, send me a check, and sends a check. And when he gets the check, the gold dealer puts it all into a little box and ships it off to the speculator, and he gets it. And then holds on to it for a week or 2 weeks or so, and then sells it to someone else. They send him a check, and he puts it in a little box and puts the address on it, takes it to the post office and sends it, and he pockets the difference. Okay, well, there's nothing wrong with this, right? So just some guy trading, and everybody voluntarily and in good faith traded their stuff. But it's kind of a pain. The speculator he doesn't really ever want to keep the gold. He's just buying it low and selling it high. So he doesn't really like the idea that it's shipped to him. So the dealer comes up with an interesting idea. He says, okay, here's what I'll do. I'll hold on to the coin for you, and I'll just send you a piece of paper, like with my name and phone number on it, and you can just sell the piece of paper to whoever you want to, and then they can call me and collect their gold. So the speculator says, okay, sends a check. The gold dealer writes out a little certificate that says, okay, this certificate entitles the bearer to 1 gold coin, and he sends it back to the speculator, and then the speculator can trade the certificate. And no problem, the person who buys the certificate is allowed to call the gold dealer and collect the coin. But maybe the person who buys it says, oh, you know what? Price is still going up. I'm going to hold on to this, and then I'm going to sell it in a few weeks. And then soon there's a market for these certificates trading back and forth because the price of gold is going up and down. Everybody thinks they're smarter than the next guy, and they're trying to sell high, buy buy low, sell high. Sorry, I know how to do this. So then the dealer gets a devious idea. And he says, you know what? No one ever calls for the gold anymore. I send them a certificate for the coin, but they never want to pick up the gold. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to print up 9 more certificates, and I'm going to sell those too. I'm going to collect the fees, even though I only have 1 coin, and put those into this gold certificate market. Right now, if the market's big enough, nobody really notices. Everybody's trading back and forth. The market's liquid, and everybody's happy with that. Until one day they kind of get the idea. It's like, wait a minute, there's more certificates than there are gold coins. And so they start calling the dealer, and they call their gold, and they say, hey, send me the coin, right? Because they start to realize some of these certificates are worthless, and we've been treating them as if they represent gold. So there's a run on the gold dealer, and he's got to deal out the coins, but he doesn't have them. So at this point, what do you think of our dealer? He's a fraud, isn't he? This is a guy who sold 10 certificates. Each one says, call me up and I'll send you a gold coin. And he only had 1 coin, right? This is clearly fraudulent. This guy's going to jail. Now, suppose at the moment that he's having this run on his gold and everybody's calling, someone runs in to save him. Let's call it the Fed. And the Fed can miraculously create 9 new gold coins out of thin air, right? And the Fed hands the gold coins to the dealer, and now the dealer has all 9, and so he can fill his calls, or he can just kind of wave them around and say, guys, I have the coins. Like, don't panic, don't call me for the coins. Just go ahead and all the speculators are like, oh, okay, dealer's got the coins. We can just continue to trade our certificates, and the market calms down. People stop calling, and they go back to trading. But now the gold dealer's sitting there saying, hey, now I've got 10 coins. You know what I can do, right? I can print another 90 certificates and trade those out. Man, I'm making a killing on this stuff, right? And then now there's 100 certificates out there levered off these 10 gold coins. And the same thing happens. After a while, the market gets suspicious. They start calling the gold. There's a run. The Fed rushes in and prints up another 90 gold coins and hands them to the dealer. All right, I think you might agree that this system is fraudulent and that the Fed is allowing the dealers to cheat and make way more money than they should based on what they had, right? I think this is obvious to everyone. Like, this is not how things should work. Now, of course, the Fed can't create gold coins out of thin air to fill in the hole when there's a run, which is why they've abandoned gold, right? This is why you go to Federal Reserve notes and bank deposits. So let's switch now from gold. So you might be saying at this point, okay, great, Ken, this is all about gold. What do I care about gold? Like, that's not, nobody cares about the gold market. Okay, let's take this over to closer to real life, to bank deposits. So now the banks, when they take in their deposits, it's an interesting thing. If you wanted to lend $1,000 to your neighbor, what would you have to do first? You'd have to save $1,000, right? Like, you can't lend them money that you don't have. Well, unless you're a bank, right? So if your bank takes in $1 million in deposits, you might think naively that they'd be allowed to loan out $1 million, right? But in fact, through the skullduggery of what you call fractional reserve banking, they can lend out $10 million off of that $1 million. Just like the gold dealer was selling 10 certificates off of his 1 gold coin, right? And as long as people don't realize it, as long as the funny money is still accepted everywhere and it's trading fine, the bank can kind of get by with only having only having 1 million to back the 10 million in claims that it sent out. But if people get wise to this and they come in and they call the bank, then there's a bank run, and the bank could go insolvent unless the Fed rushes in and fills in the missing reserves that they don't have. Now, so you might ask, okay, how is with the gold dealer, they were selling these certificates that said you can come and get gold. What are banks selling? I don't get it. Banks are writing loans. Okay, so what the bank does, they get $1 million in cash, and they say, great, let's write out $10 million in loans. We're gonna put $10 million into our customers' checking accounts, and then we'll just tell them with 10 customers each have $1 million, but actually only have $1 million. But as long as they don't write too many checks in one day, we can probably get by, because there'll be more depositors and some people will pay their loans back. And as long as there's a big enough market, we can kind of skate by on this and no one will figure it out. So what happens is the banks, of course, when they loan money out, what happens when you get a loan from the bank? You have to pay it back, but you also have to pay what? Interest on your loan, right? So this is how banks make their money. They loan out money, which they don't have, right? They loan out money and people have to pay interest on that. And so that's how they make their money, right? That's where their profit comes from, by charging interest on these loans. So it's in the bank's interest, so to speak, to loan out as many loans as they possibly can. The more loans they loan out, the more interest they rake in. However, if they do too much, people get suspicious and they go, wait a minute, I don't think these guys have the money. Just like in that Jimmy Stewart movie, right? They all come running in and say, I want my money, and that's called a bank run. And so in the old days, before the Fed, all the banks used to try to inflate as much. This is called inflation, creating these fake loans. They inflate their currency as much as they could, and then they could get into a bank run. Or even if they tried to back each other up, let's say Bank A makes a bunch of fake loans to their customers, And Bank A customer writes a huge check to some other guy to buy, I don't know, a house, right? And that guy takes it to Bank B and cashes it at Bank B. Well, Bank B is looking at this check that's drawn on Bank A, and they're like, yeah, we got to see the money, right? The bankers know what's going on. So they demand payment from Bank A. So if Bank A makes too many loans and too many of their customers are writing checks, drawing against Bank A, they have to hand out their reserves to the other banks. The other banks are demanding payment because they cashed the check. So they say, okay, you send us the money, right? We actually cashed out cash here. And then that would also cause banks to go insolvent and fall apart. So, and that's really bad because it casts doubt on the whole banking sector. Bankers don't like that. If people don't trust the banks, then they don't put their money in. The bankers don't make any money. So they invented this thing called the Fed, which would be in charge of inflating the currency. So the Fed would set the rate and say, look, you can only leverage up a factor of 10 to 1. So you have to have 10% reserves, let's say. And if there ever was, and that way, the incentive for one bank to lever up even higher would be removed because they're all going to work in this cartel called the Fed, right? And then that would eliminate the tendency of one bank that over-levered to go bankrupt and cause the whole system to become unstable. So now the Fed is allowed to create these reserves. And so let's say you have a bank with $1 million in reserves, or $1 million in cash, let's call it. Reserves are slightly different. And they loan out 10 million. And then people get wind of it and they start to call on the bank and they say, hey, we want our money. We want our actual money. Like, you gave us this loan certificate that said we can have $1 million, $10 million. We want it. And they don't have the money. Now the Fed can come in and just print the money and fill in the gap, right? So they print new money, they fill in the other 9 million that's missing, and now the bank has $10 million in cash. Everybody gets happy. They're like, okay, cool, they have the money. Everybody goes back to life. And now what does the bank do? They lever that up to 100 million. They do out $100 million in loans. And when they get in trouble with that, the Fed comes in and prints the 90 million and fills in the gaps. And it's like, okay, you're whole again, you're solvent. Everybody goes back to thinking life is normal. And then they lever up to $1 billion, right? And so this is not only the banks, this is also what I would call, in what I call the financial economy, right? People are using derivatives and mortgage-backed securities and credit default swaps and collateralized debt obligations and God knows what else. And a lot of these things are claims on stuff they don't have, right? They don't have stocks, but they sell them anyway. They don't have gold coins, they sell them anyway. They don't have money, but they loan it out anyway. And they take something, they have $1 and they leverage it up and they sell 10 derivatives on that dollar. So that 10 people out there in the market, 10 counterparties, have a claim on that dollar. And it's all, everything's fine and good as long as nobody calls them for that dollar and say, hey, send it to me, because they only have one, right? And if 2 people call, they're in a lot of trouble. Now they're in an insolvency crisis, and the Fed will come in and print. So in one way, this is super simplified, but one way to think about this is in the financial economy, all these speculators, they lever up, they have $1 million, and they create $10 million of derivatives. And then eventually the system starts to collapse. Everybody wants their money. The money is not there. The Fed comes in and creates the money and prints the other 9 million. Now they have 10 million. So they lever up to 100. Everything's fine for several years. And then there's a crisis. And then everybody starts calling for their money. And the Fed prints the other 90 million, makes it up to 100 million. Now they lever up to $1 billion. Everything's fine for a while. There's a crisis. The Fed comes in, prints the other 900 million. Now they lever up to 10 billion. Right? And this just keeps going and going and going. So what's the problem here? The problem is, of course, that, well, the Fed's counterfeiting money and giving it to these speculators, right? Every time they bail them out, the bubble gets bigger and bigger and bigger. If you've seen my previous videos, I've called the financial economy like a cancer on the real economy. And so when the cancer is really small, it's like, okay, it's kind of cute. Don't worry about it. It's over there on the side. It's not doing any harm. Each time there's a crisis, the Fed makes it bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and now it dwarfs the size of the real economy. There's quadrillions of dollars of derivatives out there, and there's not that much wealth on the planet. There's not $1 quadrillion of wealth on the planet. So what happens when all these people who have these claims, these derivatives and collateralized debt obligations for all this money, and they say, hey, I want my money. Well, there is no money. So the Fed just creates it and hands it to them. And then as soon as everything calms down, they use that to lever up again to make even larger bets, right? And the other bad thing about that is that they're playing with what are essentially real dollars, right? Like the dollar that we use in the United States is fake money invented by the Fed, and they can just create more of it. And so the more money these guys have from the financial economy, the more of it leaks over into the real economy, which then distorts everything we have. These super rich bankers can come over and buy houses and yachts and wine and clothing, which takes away from the rest of us who are not in that economy. And the bigger, every time there's a crisis, their financial economy just gets bigger and bigger. So they have more and more of this, of dollars that were counterfeited by the Fed to come over and have more and more claims on the real economy that you and I all work in. So I hope you can see that this whole system is totally fraudulent. It's built on fraud. And in fact, I meant to look up this date, but I forgot. When fractional reserve banking first started, it actually started exactly the way I told you. It was people storing gold in the bank, and then the bank starting to loan out a given coin more than one time. And when people realized what was going on, they were taken to court and they were sued for fraud because they said, hey, you told 10 customers that you would give them a gold coin. You only had one coin to give. Like, that's clearly fraud, right? And then you charge them all interest on the fake gold that you didn't have to lend them, right? Clearly this is not cool. What they didn't realize at the time was that the banks had okayed this with the king. Now, kings back in those days, you always think of the king as opulent, but they were often very close to bankruptcy because kings loved to go make war, and building all those ships and hiring all those soldiers and sailing across the ocean, doing all this stuff costs huge amounts of money that the kings didn't have. And they could only get a certain amount out of taxation before the people revolted. So the bankers came to them and said, hey, we came up with this scheme called fractional reserve banking. We're going to cut you in on some of the action here, king, as long as you protect us, because people aren't going to like it when they find out. And the king is like, whoa, this is awesome. We can counterfeit money and we can loan out fake money that we don't actually have and get real money interest. Sign me up, right? So they sued the banks for this. I believe this was in the early 17th century, although I'd have to go look. There was a lawsuit in England where they took it to a judge and say the banks, this fractional reserve lending is a fraudulent practice, which of course was the correct answer. The judge ruled against them because guess who pays the judge? The king, right? And I'm sure the king had a little, someone from the king's court had a little talk with that judge and say, look, if you know what's good for you, you're going to rule that this is a legal thing. And ever since then, governments and fractional reserve banking have been tied together at the hip. It's basically these fractional reserve banks, that Wall Street is the financial arm of the government, right? And they, the government regulates Wall Street, which is total BS, right? Wall Street tells them exactly what to do. They are the money machine for the government, and the state and this fractional reserve banking complex have been co-evolving for, 300, 400 years now. And so when people say the system is rigged against you, yeah, it is, because they're creating fake money and then charging you for the privilege of telling you that you have fake money, right? And if everybody went to get their money at the same time, you would find that there is no money there. So that's really fraudulent. The other thing, of course, is that building an entire financial system off leverage like this, where every real asset is leveraged 10 to 1. In other words, every gold coin is pledged to 10 different people. Every dollar is pledged to 10 different people. Every piece of real estate, every stock is owned by 10 different people. We actually don't have fractional reserve real estate, but it happens in the stock market too. It's just a recipe for instability, right? You can see this that at any time, as long as there's only a certain small fraction of people that call for the underlying asset, you can kind of get by with this fraud. But as soon as they start to call, and if, let's say, we've been using 10 to 1 as a leverage, as soon as the number of people calling exceeds 10%, it's a total disaster, right? The whole thing starts to fall apart. People start to realize the claims that they spend a lot of money on, these loans and these notes that say you own a gold coin, they're worthless, right? And so suddenly it's like a giant game of musical chairs where there's 100 players and only 10 chairs, and everyone's trying to sit down. And the chaos that that causes ripples through the real economy and hurts real people. It causes people to lose their jobs, causes companies to go bankrupt. All because the entire financial system is built on speculative fraud, right? The economists will tell you, oh, it's great because now we have more credit in the system, and then we get more. There's more wealth. It's like, no, there's the same number of gold coins as there was before, right? Pretending that there's 10 times more gold coins than there actually are doesn't create wealth. It creates instability. All right. I hope you stuck through to the end. I hope that makes a little bit of sense and gives you some insight into why the financial system is so fraudulent, so corrupt at its very core. This is not what the media will tell you, but this is Ken DeLong from the Economic Comic reminding you, don't believe what you're being told to believe. Think for yourself. Form your own opinions. Use your own brain. All right, and if you do that, I'll see you on the next video. Hey guys, if you want to understand more about economics, but you're just tired of the jargon and the technobabble of professional economists and media pundits, then check out my book, The Economic Comic, which is available on Amazon. There you can learn some of the concepts of economics through comics. Thanks for listening.